Am I there? Okay. Start with field trip, and then at the end of September, we're going to the San Antonio Botanical Garden for a guided tour, and that's going to be one you'll need to register for online, so they'll be sure and have enough docents for it. That information will be on the blog, on the website. We have a Hidden Springs plant survey in October, and we're going to River Ranch County Park on November 26th for a tour. That's our post-Thanksgiving get outside and play trip. And Sue Weissman, who is on a bus to Denali right now, so she can't hear me saying this, assures me that we're all going to get in free for this. So she has the clout. And speaking of River Ranch, we did participate. Here's the ribbon cutting. That's Sue right there in the bright green t-shirt on the front row. That was the 21st. And then the next day, we had our plant booth giving away free plants at the pavilion down by the playground. Very well received, and a good time was had by all. We did that Saturday and Sunday. Same day, July 22nd, we were at the Goodwater Master Naturalist chapter event, from balconies to backyards, and we had a good time there. You see which booth was probably the more comfortable to man, between the lovely view, air conditioned, of course. And yours truly was a speaker, and some of you, my mouse ran away with me. And there are at least, you two aren't the only ones in the room. Brad, where are you? Brad back there on the back row. Yeah, I've heard from him too. No. Somebody at this meeting at the booth said something to Randy and I, and Randy said, are y'all buddies or something? I don't know. And Randy looked at him and said, we get one another in trouble a lot. And I didn't argue because she had gotten me in trouble at the July meeting. And so I was like, yeah, that's correct. And then, right off the bat, then here we go with this. And, Brad saw Randy's yard in my talk, and he's like, we're going to go to Randy's yard. I said, see, I've got you in trouble. But Randy's got a great yard. Okay, upcoming program next month is on, Colleen Dieter is going to talk about collecting seeds and saving seeds. That's an item dear to many of your hearts, and there's some good techniques to learn. There's some, you can stumble along not knowing what you're doing, collecting grass clippings or the equivalent of grass chaff. So some good things to learn there. Then Ashley Landry, who is sitting back here, will be our speaker in October. She's our plant rescue coordinator, and she's become so famous across the United States. Bow to her. She has really put us on the map, and we support her 100%. Then we'll have Bill Carr doing academic science, the botany versus citizen science, and then we have our annual silent auction and gathering back at the library, and then Wizzy Brown will talk about fire ant control, which is a really good program in January. I have the location up in the air for October and November. It might be in here. We have this room booked for those two meetings, but we're hoping something else comes up. Nancy Pumphrey.
I did see that we're moving forward on the tech stuff.
Brown Rock Library. Okay. Okay. So anyway. This place is a dark hole once daylight, 7 o'clock at night, once daylight savings time has passed. But, right, free plants this month are the Maitlia reticulata, the pearl milkweed vine. This is monarch caterpillar food. It gets the name reticulata. A little botany lesson here. You can see this on the picture. You can't tell it on the tag, but see how the little green veins are like veins? The veins are highlighted in the flower. It's reticulate. Is reticulata. And this is a plant that Randy has growing in her yard just on a trellis up against the wall. So plenty of foliage there for monarch caterpillars to stop by and munch on. Right, this is where you can find us. I'm always telling people, you sign up for our blog, and I'll have another slide for that, but we have a lot of wonderful talks from previous months, years, and so forth on our YouTube channel. I myself refer to them because I remember, oh, so-and-so said something about that. Is he on YouTube? Oh, yes, he is. Okay, I can go back and look and read it again. You can find us on Facebook. That's where I have to announce what plant we're going to give away, because it's kind of like the lottery. I don't know until I get up to Barbara's what I'm going to give, so I can't get it on the blog in time. So I thought, okay, you're just going to have to check Facebook the day of the meeting. You'll find out what your free plant's going to be. And then we're on Instagram, and Beth Ann just put it on Instagram. So, right. Keep pounding this. We had over 300 blog subscribers before we changed the website. And now we're a little over 100. So if you're not getting the blog, if you're not getting the announcements for the blog, for the meetings and so forth, you must go in and resubscribe. We don't sell your email or bug you. This is my last meeting as president. And I put this slide up here to remind you of who your new folks are going to be. Nancy Copperman is suffering up in coast of Washington State. But I really want to appreciate my officers. Cindy Chrysler has been fabulous, still fabulous. In fact, the master naturalist snatched her up. So Nancy has done a great job as secretary, finding us a place to meet every month. And Ann has done a terrific job as treasurer. And Vicki Blockman has been very supportive as a director, and so is Mark Stutzer. And then Randy has worked very hard as past president, keeping me in line and getting me in trouble. Big thanks to all of them. Randy especially did a good job finding that new slate of officers. And then this is our appointed board. We do have somebody for membership now. We still have education open. Kind of working on Beth Ann. Probably she'll make me sign a contract on how much I'll help her. But anyway, we'd like to get that going again. Everybody's done a terrific job. Always take note of the meeting. Obviously, we're back over here in the hole behind the river. We'll be here next month, as far as we know. And an in-person attendee tonight will get a copy. If you've got your little blue tag, and draw that at the top. But this is what Adam recommended, Wild Orchid Texas. And it is quite the tone. It is all, here's pictures, it's not all over. It's beautiful. And it is exhaustive. Correct? We endorse it. So, okay. Right. I think that's it. It's time for Adam Black, our orchid expert, who now lives in North Carolina, but cannot let his own piece of Texas go, he said.
All right. Can you all hear me? All right. Well, glad to be back. I just actually flew in from North Carolina a lot later than I expected to get into today. I was actually coming to Texas anyway. We kind of coordinated this with my annual mid-August visit, because I do a lot of oak conservation work out in West Texas and Central Texas this time of the year, with some like the rare oaks like Quercus hinklei that you may have heard of, and Depressipes, which only occurs on top of Mount Livermore, and a few other things. But even though I live in North Carolina, that was the one thing I wanted to make sure the Arboretum that I work for currently understood, is that I was going to be coming back to Texas, and they were going to pay me to do so. And they are totally happy with that, because we are we have an amazing collection of ex situ conservation collection of Texas plants that we're growing in North Carolina. They're doing remarkably well. But we'll talk about orchids today. I mean, in general, I'm just a plant nerd. I did not go to school for any of this. Just was out in the Everglades from day one. I'm originally from Florida, so not a true Texan, but my heart is definitely here and in Florida. And now in North Carolina, I get to travel all over. I just got back from the Philippines. I've got a good job. Used to work for, if any of you are familiar with what was Peckerwood Garden out in Hempstead, Texas, created by John Perry. So I became the first director once that transitioned from his private garden to a public garden. And after I moved on from there, I was just for a while in Texas here, just an independent botanical horticultural consultant, just doing a lot of plant conservation work, sometimes totally unpaid, but it's just, again, my passion, and now I get paid to do it. All right, so so just a little bit of background where I work now. Some of you might know Bartlett tree experts. They're basically in all major cities around the US or in Canada. They're in the UK and expanding from there. It's the oldest tree service company. I don't do the tree service stuff. That is just the company that funds our Arboretum, which is a research Arboretum. And we've got a diagnostic laboratory on site. And we do a lot of research, with trees, obviously, tree pathogens, a lot of just cultural techniques that we'll do in-ground studies and in a scientific manner. And we do a lot of publishing and basically advising the arboriculture community. But you'll see a trend here. The Mr. Bartlett, Robert Bartlett Jr., who's the current president, he's a plant nerd too, just like me. We've known each other forever. He wanted to start just a really cool plant collection. And so in Charlotte, North Carolina, he bought some property in 1965 and just really went all out and sourcing plants from all over the world. And so we are the largest collection of cultivated woody plants in North America. There are some in Europe that exceed us, but it's a private arboretum. We're no public allowed, so it's kind of nice. I mean, we're not exclusive or anything. We work with all the plant societies. We allow them to use our conference center for free. We work with all the universities. We're very collaborative, so we're just not here to have day-to-day visitors, but just a few shots from around the place. We also have we do a lot of plant conservation. Part of the property has been slowly turning into what Charlotte, North Carolina used to be, which was Piedmont Prairie. And so we are doing, rather than this area, this is our oak collection in the back there. You can't tell, it just looks like a native scene here, but basically this all used to be finely manicured, all mowed once a week. And at one point it was just decided there's a better use for this. And so we started planting all the plants that used to occur throughout much of the Charlotte region. And so we're continuing to look at our arboretum that way, just transitioning it from this manicured mowed lawn to a more biodiverse place. We work with all sorts of institutions around the country with a lot of plant conservation projects. Oaks are a big one, orchids are another, which we'll go into more here. But a lot of other weird things. Again, I just got back from the Philippines. We're working on a project there with about 50 other collaborators, basically trying to get into some of these areas in southern Mindanao, just rescuing a lot of these things that are about to disappear, basically, because all the land's getting converted to agriculture, and it's just a losing battle to be able to set aside any preserved land there. So we're just getting in there, finding all these new species and getting them into cultivation so that we can at least learn from them before they're all lost. And so orchids, I'm going to kind of go around the state with some of the experiences I've had here. I last gave a version of this talk to the Pines and Prairies chapter in NIPSOT in Montgomery County there. So that's why I kind of started off here in Montgomery County. And some friends of mine who do wetlands delineations contacted me one day and said they were out on this piece of property and found a bunch of cranefly orchids, which, I mean, they're not very rare in East Texas, but, and they're not the most showy things. They're interesting, but if you're into showy things, there's definitely more interesting stuff in East Texas. But generally through the warmer months, they'll just have a single leaf per stem, but they will form colonies like this. But then later in summer, they'll, well, early summer actually, they'll drop their leaves, disappear, and then right around this time of the year, they'll just suddenly send up these flower spikes. No leaves at all, just these kind of cryptic inflorescences that the light has to be just right for them to really stand out among the leaf litter. Otherwise, they're just, you'll just walk right by them. And so they knew that this land was going to be, that they did this wetland delineation on was going to be developed into a cookie cutter neighborhood in the outskirts of Conroe. And so they wanted to go rescue these things. I thought, well, I'll go join them, see what else there may be on that property. And so we got in there, found lots of them, greenfly orchids, and they dug up a bunch, and we're going to put them in a different spot. And so I started looking around, and I came across this. This is not an orchid, but still it's a very habitat-specific plant that's a mycoheterotrope. It's one of those things that's kind of like a parasite that'll basically have a connection to the mycorrhizae of certain plants and basically glean nutrients from a tree or another plant that via the mycorrhizae. So kind of indirectly sucking nutrients from the plant, but not directly tapped into it like a direct parasite. But it's got no chlorophyll. It's not photosynthetic. It's just this very ghostly kind of purple color. It's only like that tall, even though it looks kind of big here. But it's kind of surprising to see this in Montgomery County, because if you look at this Bonat map, and these are just I'll be showing a lot of these tonight for some of the various species I talked about. These Bonat maps are only based off of herbarium specimens. They're not, they can definitely occur in other counties here. So basically each shaded in county is basically where there's been an official documentation of this species. And again, I know where there's like a North Florida, I know where some of those other counties are filled in, but you can see where Montgomery County is there. It has never been documented there. And so that is the westernmost population that's about to be destroyed. In fact, it is destroyed by now. But you can see anywhere where there's yellow, that means it's considered by that state to be rare. And in certain habitats, it's usually found in bagels. It can be common over in like Newton and Jasper County along the Louisiana border, but the further west, suitable habitat gets very few and far between. So it was kind of neat and got me going. Made me wonder what else is here. And so I kept walking and suddenly found these. These are not in flower here, but instantly recognized it as this guy, showing it in flower here. Again, not the most showy, but still a pretty interesting orchid, the Cultivar orchid, Platanthera clavilata. And usually these grow along seeps, along moving water, never any like stagnant pools or anything like that. They definitely like to have that kind of spring-fed water flowing through their roots there. And again, one of those things that habitat for these is not very common anymore, especially with just a lot of changes in hydrology through development of the surrounding land. So it was neat to see these, and they were everywhere. It's one of the best populations I've seen in Texas, actually. And so my friends started pulling a lot of those up and bagging them to rescue some of the genetics from there. And by the way, even though that's a wetland, the developer just totally ignores that. It's just how things work, especially in Montgomery County. It's just going through the motions of wetlands and delineations. That bog was apparently going to be turning into a retention pond. So that's kind of how things tend to work. But so we started looking around more, and then this other guy pops up at me, which it's hard to judge scale here. It looks kind of similar to those previous orchids that were in fruit. This one's in fruit as well. This was right around this time of the year. So these had flowered like the month prior, like July, and instantly recognized it as Platanthera crispata, which is a pretty impressive orchid. Very few populations of this left in East Texas, and definitely none left in Montgomery County anymore. These were taken in Tyler County, in the Big Thicket Preserve, where there's one little seepage that's got a nice little population along it, but these are few and far between nowadays. And so basically you can see there are the two county records there for Montgomery and Harris County, where Houston is, but those were from the early 1900s. There are all those original documentations are long gone. It was known where they were, and those sites just don't exist anymore. But here it's rediscovered in a site that, again, is about to be destroyed. So we found it and we lost it. But those seeds that I showed you earlier, I gave my friend Peter Zale up at Longwood Gardens in Pennsylvania a call. He's we'll talk about him a little bit later, but he does basically all my orchid germination work in his laboratory. And I showed him photos of the capsules, and he said they're perfect. Collect the seeds, send them up to me. So we've got hundreds of seedlings from that population preserved at the very least. So those westernmost genetics we now have at least preserved somewhere, even though it's not in habitat. But I've seen on recent satellite images this whole site is all bulldozed. And there are the fruits there. Normally these fruits would dry up, turn brown, and crack open and release. Basically, the seeds are like dust inside of them and they just blow away. But for the purposes of laboratory germination, Peter likes them green. So we like to collect the capsules while they're still green on the outside, but the seeds are fully mature on the inside. He's found that basically if we can just cut those seeds out of there, put them on the media, which I'll go over that process a little bit later, they germinate a lot quicker, almost instantly, and they'll result in stronger plants than if we were to collect the dried dormant seed later on, which you get weaker plants that are slower to establish, and you get a much lower germination rate, whereas almost every seed will germinate. So he's really perfected these methods for getting these things going. So that's Tim and Ileana. Those are the folks who alerted me to this site. This is kind of a bagel environment where they're salvaging all these orchids here, the actual plants, and then I was taking the actual seeds and getting them up there. There's some of our haul there. And those actually, we got permission to replant those in Sam Houston National Forest. I worked with them a lot, so I have good connections with their National Forest botanist. Other Platanthera in East Texas, Platanthera chapmanii. If you've ever been to Watson River Plant Preserve in Tyler County, the big thicket area, that's where one of the main populations of these left in Texas is. And then there's a few other populations on state land nearby, but a lot of what was in East Texas is long gone. You can see it's very scattered range where it naturally grows, mostly in northern Florida there. But even there, it requires very specific habitat, fire maintained pine flatwoods that have a certain amount of moisture, not too much, not too little. But that's one that a lot of people have focused on conservation, so I'm not really working with those. And then Platanthera integra, this has not been recorded in Texas since 2016. It was actually thought to be extirpated in Texas in 2014 when the last population in Angelina National Forest just suddenly disappeared, maybe got poached. And but then some was discovered a couple of years later on private land in Jasper County, and the landowner decided that he didn't care about them enough to manage the land, so he let them all get smothered, and they are gone. So it's not known from Texas anymore. Where I am in the Carolinas now, there's just a few left up there. It's was totally extirpated in South Carolina for a couple decades until last year. One plant was found. Probably more there, but the land's going to start getting better managed. It is state land, so we're going to try to work on those. But just because you see all these county records doesn't mean it's there anymore. A lot of those are very historic. So moving on to the post Oak Savannah, where I had been living the past 6 or 8 years, kind of between Navasota and College Station. When I bought my property, I basically, again, moved from Florida. Got some property between out there in the post Oak Savannah, and bought it in wintertime. Everything was just brown, and I just liked the rural feel out there. I wasn't really expecting much from the land there. The previous owners had just been mowing everything religiously. And once spring came and I stopped mowing, all these wonderful things came out of the woodwork in the prairie areas and back in the woodlands. And I knew about Navasota ladystress as this endangered species, but I had never really been in the area to look for it. And when I started doing a little bit more research that year I moved here, I began to realize I may have some suitable property on my suitable habitat on my property. And so by September, when they usually start flowering, I went out to my property, and sure enough, there they were. And visited a lot of other sites in the College Station area, which is where it mainly exists in Brazos County and adjacent Grimes County, Washington County, all just these upper drainages of that eventually flow into the Brazos River, usually just right on these little pour overs going into these little intermittent streams here, and almost always associated with a particular moss that tends to grow right in that zone too. That probably helps with their seed germination. But I thought that was really cool that I have the species just growing on my property. So we of course got seeds of this all backed up at Longwood, and those have been distributed around to a number of other botanic gardens. Another shot of just kind of the habitat where they tend to grow. Again, these kind of slopes, usually upper slopes, just above where these little intermittent streams flow, but never down below, never on flat surface. They'd never be up on top there, just always in that kind of upper zone there. You can see that that moss that I was talking about there. Going back a little bit further east in Texas, there's kind of a rare habitat called the Catahoula sandstone glades, where you get this shallow exposure of sandstone with very little organic material in it, and therefore there's just these very limited pockets where plants can root in there. So usually a lot of trees will only be rooting around the edges where the soil is a little bit deeper, and you only get certain plants that can tolerate these tight root zones here. But a lot of very interesting plants, including orchids. And there's this thing, which is probably a new species. Everybody tries to pigeonhole it into Spiranthes lacera, which is something that's better known more like from coastal Carolinas down to Florida into Alabama. But west of the Mississippi, it seems like we have a totally different thing. This really doesn't look anything like lacera like I know further east, and it doesn't really look like anything else. So it's one of those many things out there that just needs more study. But meanwhile, we know it only occurs on these Catahoula sandstone barrens, nowhere else. So it's, in my mind, a very rare plant and needs a name. So we've already started getting seeds propagated of this. We've got thousands of them now from both here and adjacent Louisiana, and a couple of barrens that are in Kisatchie National Forest. And so that one we got pretty well set, and now it just needs a name. And it's it just doesn't really make sense because there's lacera, which is in the again in the southeastern coastal plain further east, which blooms around May or so, and then there's Lacera bradyphracillus, which is actually pretty common throughout a lot of eastern third of Texas, and blooms in September. Which, why would two variations of a particular species have two totally different habitats and two totally different flowering times? It's there's a lot of work to be done in orchids here, but this is pretty common a little bit further east here. I've seen some really, in fact, that one population on the left there was taken around just outside of LaGrange. The other two were taken on my property in Brazos County. But it's a common roadside plant, this particular one, so not really of any conservation concern. This one is, though. There's only 2 sites left for this species in Texas, and both of them are on mowed roadsides, not in actual habitat anymore, because where they used to grow in habitat, they needed those regular fire maintained open pinelands, which over a period of time, the sites where these were, they just got totally, they weren't managed properly, they weren't getting burned, so they all got smothered out. But they were able to creep into these mowed roadsides where they actually, I know why you probably scoff sometimes when they mow it not quite the right time and mow your favorite wildflowers along the side of the road. These actually want that mowing because it's taking the place of the fire that used to cut back all that competing vegetation. But show you in a second. The challenge with this one is this one flowers in around October, right about the time they're going to be doing their fall mowing in this area here. So I'd marked all these with orange tape and was going to come back for seeds a few weeks later. And of course, between when I saw them flowering in the previous photo and when I came back, they mowed the entire thing down. So I just found like a few little nubs sticking up. And a friend of mine, Matt Buckingham, works for TxDOT, and he's actually the one that one of the main folks who designates the no-mow zones or controlled mow zones specifically for rare plants. And so he knows about this. He had been working on it, but it's not something that just happens instantly, of course, with the bureaucratic system. So it is now protected, but as of last year. But this year, they all got mowed, so I lost my chance at seed. So the next year, I had an idea where when I visited him with my dog, I went ahead and I took like a metal U-stake and I basically carefully laid them down parallel to the ground and just staked them down, hoping they would be out of the range of the mowers, but not bending the plants themselves, because I knew they were going to come along. And so did that with about 30 plants. And 3 weeks later, came back for seeds, and of course they had mowed. And you can see some of my flagging tape still there. So being that it wasn't chopped up, I got optimistic as I approached, but then I found that they still saved off some of them. But one lost, but then found this one where it actually did make it. It was still flowering on top, but on the lower third there was good seed already. It's basically that they bloomed from the bottom to the top in succession. So even though the top is still blooming, the bottom seeds were perfectly ripe. So I was able to get quite a bit of seed off of this and several other individuals. And this one just kind of got nicked by the mower, but still I was able to get a few good capsules out of those. So called a success, but even more of a success now that we've got those seedlings going elsewhere and we've got that population actually preserved somewhat. The contracted mowers don't always pay attention to those signs, as some of you may have seen before, but it's the best we can do. Getting into the Blackland Prairie, you have another Spiranthes, brevilabris. All those sites that you see in East Texas there are all gone except for one spot in Walker County outside of Huntsville, which is this site. And the little tiny thing, it's easy to miss. You can see it in its size in relation to the green milkweed, the Asclepias viridis back there. It's a very delicate plant. And in these prairies, which this is in Sam Houston National Forest, they maintain these prairies with fire, but the geology changes a little bit and it dictates the plant communities. You can see where Brandy is there in the foreground. There's very little in the way of the blue stem, and that's where the orchids are. They will not creep into that thicker blue stem just above there, and it's mainly because the soil profiles change there. It's a little bit heavier clay down on this slope in the foreground here, and everywhere where we had pink flags is a plant that we were marking to come back for seed, which we did. And again, I was mentioning the dust-like seeds that all these orchids produce. That's basically the contents of that one little capsule that was plucked off of that plant there. And there's probably more in there as well. gust of wind comes along, it'll just all be gone. And out in West Texas, a lot of people are surprised to learn that there are orchids out in the Chihuahuan Desert ecoregion, but there are some very spectacular ones. This particular one, usually every year someone sends me a photo of this exact one, which is along the trail going to Boot Canyon. You can't miss it, and everybody thinks they're the first one to see it, of course, even though it's on such a well-used trail, but I'm surprised nobody's plucked this out of the ground and taken it home with them. It's been there for many years, but just looks to a lot of people, it doesn't even look like an orchid. It looks like, if you're familiar with things like the South African plants, it just looks like some of these South African weird lilies that grow up in the deserts there. And it even has very succulent foliage. You can see there, it almost looks like a little aloe or something like that. Blooms every year, regardless how dry it is. It's got a really thick root system that stores water, so it seems to be able to not really care about the extremes out there. It definitely produces much larger flower heads in the wetter years, and these are kind of short in these drier years here, but they always seem to go. And these barely get up into the U.S. in the Chihuahuan Mountains and the Davis Mountains. Otherwise, they're more common down in Mexico, but those are the only two places you can find them. And so nobody's ever really done any work with this. So we got permission from the National Park Service, got permits to collect seeds of it a few years ago. So Longwood is having some difficulty with these. These are just not behaving like most of the other orchid seeds that they worked with. So we've had to do recollection several times just to kind of hone down the protocols for being able to grow these. So we're still working on that. He's having some success now, but still wants to work at it a bit more. And back to the post Oak Savannah. A few years ago, there's a woman out in Colorado County who contacted me all excited about how she knew what she had. She was no beginner to plants or anything, and she was very excited about having these Oklahoma grass pink orchids pop up on her property. And basically, she and her husband had bought this land that was just totally choked out by yaupon, and cleared all that out, did some selective removal, some of the other trees just to open it up a bit and create kind of a mosaic of trees and kind of open areas that they wanted to transition into prairie. And literally basically they did that in summertime, and then literally that next April, all these things just came up out of the woodwork. So these had all just been hiding dormant underneath that thick layer of yaupon. She had talked to her neighbors, and they had said that that land hadn't been cleared at all for at least 2 decades. So somehow these things were probably putting up some pathetic foliage down there just to sustain that root system, and they were just waiting for a big change. Probably in the past, this would have been a fire that would come through and just burn all that stuff off, and these things would just come to life again. And it's just amazing all that stored energy that they have to just erupt out of the ground like that after just sitting forever. And she had quite a few of them and lots of different color variations of it. And interestingly, where they had pulled out some trees where there was like a big crater left, that seemed to be where a lot of the concentrations were, strangely enough. And then that same year, a friend of mine took me to a site up near Athens, Texas, where they had come through and scraped underneath that power line easement. There were all these woody plants that they just had been growing for 6 or 8 years, and they came through and just cleared it all out, just bulldozed it. And sure enough, a whole bunch of these came up, especially where these trees were ripped up. So there's a lot to learn about this species here and its ability to persist in poor conditions. And it just goes to show that you should definitely never give up on some land and think that it's basically a lost cause. It can still harbor some pretty interesting things. And these are not very common orchids nowadays. There are very scattered sites in East Texas. Maybe we need to clear more land and see what happens. But they become more common, as the name suggests, up in Oklahoma. They're basically a prairie plant. A lot of these other species, calipogan, are wetland growers in bogs or seepages. But these actually like it dry. Very unusual in the genus. And there was a historic record in Brazos County, near where I was living, at Lick Creek Park. But Joe Liggio, the author of the book here, took me to where he remembered seeing them about 10 years prior, and it was totally choked out. And we were trying to get them to the park to do some clearing, but it never really happened. But there was a development just outside of College Station that I always thought had some suitable habitat in it. They left green spaces along these drainages specifically for that Navasota lady's tresses orchid, since that's an endangered species. They have to leave the habitat there and basically build homes all around it. So I thought that was a good place to check at the right time of the year when things are blooming. And I scoured that whole area. They have these trail systems through there, and I found that one clump and no other ones. And it's, as you can see, it's right along this path going up to someone's house there. You can see the corner of their house and their property marker there. And they had been stepped on a couple times too along the trail here. So that's basically the only set of plants known in Brazos County or anywhere close to it before you get to that population in Colorado County that I was talking about. Not to say that there couldn't be more hiding out there, but at least the ones we know, we just have that one clone there. We probably think that is all one individual plant as opposed to multiple genetic individuals. But still, I self-pollinated it and got seeds of it just so we can have some of those genetics in our collection. And when I pollinate this, it's a pretty high-tech thing where I find like a piece of garbage or a little stick and basically squeeze the pollinia. Pollinia are just basically like sticky pollen bundles that orchids tend to have out of the anther there, which is labeled on the tip of the of what's called the column there. And so you can see that little piece of wire that I just happened to found on site there has some pollinia, and that's going to go. You can see where that top red arrow is pointing on the stigma, which is just behind the anther, and just stick it on there, and it basically absorbs in and will eventually form these seed capsules here. Normally what would happen with pollinators, bees being the pollinator, they would be attracted to that lip up on top there that has all those what are called staminodes. They look like stamens, but they don't have there no anthers on, no pollen on them at all. But visually, they'll just go for that because it looks like that's what they should go for. And that lip is hinged, and so once they land on it, the weight of the bee will actually plop them down backwards onto the stigma and anther there. And so if that bee was carrying pollen from another plant already, having gone through the process, it would splat that pollen bundle onto the stigma there, and at the same time squeeze out some more pollen on its back to take to another flower. Meanwhile, the bee gets absolutely nothing out of it, no nectar or anything. And so there's been studies as to whether or not bees learn to just give up on these particular orchids because they're not getting anything, but they have recorded them repeatedly visiting flowers over and over again. And obviously, these things do get pollinated. So, and so East Texas again, the one that everybody always wants to take me to see, but I won't. The Kentucky lady slipper. Despite the county records there's only maybe a couple dozen plants left in Texas, and most of them are just individual plants that are like at least 30 miles away from the next plant. So there's no natural pollination going on. They're not. They tend to not. I can manually pollinate them, but generally they're not going to be naturally pollinated by themselves. They're these lone plants. So I was working with the Forest Service on this, going around and checking all the individual plants that grow in these ravines. And where they grow, they're very specific. They always want to grow wherever they're growing. It's right in the contact zone between the Weeches Formation, a type of limestone formation that's below a lot of East Texas and crops up along some of these incised ravines here. So they're always right in that contact zone between the Weeches Formation on top and then a variety of other clay sediments up above. So it's just the chemistry is just right where those two alkaline and then more acidic strata basically merge. And so they won't grow any very far above it or below it. They have that spot where they want to be. And they also, this is debated, nobody's proven it, but my friend Ron Dieterman, who's, if you've ever been to Atlanta Botanic Garden, he's the one who, all the orchid conservatories and everything, he's responsible for all those, as well as a lot of orchid conservation in the Southeast. He's the one that recognized that this species is always in association with flowering dogwood trees. And he told me, he said, every time you see one, look up, you're going to be in the drip zone of a dogwood. And I was like, nah, it can't be. And sure enough, everyone was when I moved to East Texas and started paying attention to that. My friend Peter Luce, some of you might know of him, been very involved in NIPSOT for many years. He was like, oh, no, I'm going to show you one that doesn't. And we got there, and sure enough, there's a little spindly one right there. But then he then started thinking, and he said, let me show you this other one here, which was just this little spindly one. It used to flower very regularly, but now it just comes up some little pathetic leaves, doesn't flower anymore. He said it hadn't flowered in the past 10, 15 years. And he said he knew there was a dogwood there, but that dogwood died a number of years ago, and it seems to correspond with when this plant stopped flowering. So whether it's mycorrhizal or something to do with just the soil chemistry, definitely needs more study. Can never take enough pictures of these, especially when they're backlit by the sun. So the way these are pollinated, basically there's that slipper-like pouch, which doesn't really look like a slipper, but some of the European species do look more like a normal slender slipper-like shape. But basically the bees will go into that pouch. They'll struggle to get out for a while because the sides are slippery, and there's downward pointing hairs that are preventing them from climbing upward. But there's basically a pathway for them to go up the back of the pouch there and force them through that little opening, which allows them to come in contact as they're pushing their way through, to come in contact with the anthers they'll get smeared with pollinia, and the stigma, if they're carrying pollen when they came in, it'll get transferred there and pollinate that plant. And so basically when we pollinate them, I'll use, here I always got fancy and used some actual forceps. That's not the case, but that's basically what the pollinia look like, very large in this species. There's two of them paired on each side, on each anther. Very sticky. And basically where the forcep is on the back there, that's basically pushing it onto the stigma. So the anther is right there in the foreground. There's still pollinium there. And I'm placing one of them on the back side. And there you can see it actually stuck to the stigma there. It always looks like it'll never work. It's just sitting there. It's not like you're sticking in anything. It's just sitting on this flat surface there. You think it's going to fall off, but somehow it just ends up working. And so I kept coming back because all these individual plants don't always bloom on the exact same schedule. So living in Navasota, I was making at minimum 3-hour drive to go to check one plant, and maybe it wasn't flowering yet, and go check on another one, and maybe it was. So I'd collect some pollen, bring it back, store it in the fridge, and come back, check that other one, check another one here, check another one there. And sometimes I would have to make it by nighttime and have to find them in the dark. This was just a nice experience, just because this was about a quarter mile back in the woods off of Forest Road, and it was totally dark. It was pouring rain and lightning all around, and So it's just one of those warm nights where it was just nice to be walking out in the rain. So I just decided to go see if I could find these orchids without my flashlight or anything, just using the lightning to guide me. It's some weird, I know, but no, it's just a beautiful time in the forest. And I found them, and when I found them, just the lightning flashes were just illuminating the orchids. Like, this is my best cell phone shot in the pouring rain. This was a lightning flash illuminating everything there. Otherwise, it was pitch dark, but it was just this neat ghostly presence in the understory there that was just really cool. I just sat there forever getting drenched. You know, I was supposed to be meeting friends in Nacogdoches for some beers, but and then finally, after I got everything pollinated, to come back 55 days later and hope to see this, the pods on it, which I would get 100% success rate on all these. And so, again, we would collect these on the green side as well. Normally, these would, we collect these around mid to late May after pollination, but normally these would dry up and release their seeds in fall. But again, that's not optimum for the lab germination techniques. We would leave some too for just natural dispersal, just in case some of them would end up taking. It was just our agreement with the Forest Service not to take all of them. And so the next step, these go to Peter Zale. He's just amazing again at what he does in terms of all the protocols he's worked out for germinating orchids in petri dishes in the laboratory. And as you might know, a lot of orchids are strongly dependent on mycorrhizae, usually in association with a particular species of this fungus that has an association with a particular type of tree. Again, maybe the dogwoods on that lady slipper. It's something that is just very poorly studied. But for some species, we actually do, when we collect the seed, we'll also collect we'll carefully expose a section of root, collect a little segment, and send that off to Peter as well, because he's going to culture some of that mycorrhizae and put it on the plate and put the seeds on there to help them germinate. But that's not always what he does. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of times with these green seeds, they don't need the fungus. They just germinate instantly. So it's kind of groundbreaking what he's doing. There was just this long saying thing that is just an obligate association, but it's really not. It's only after that seed has gone dormant. And again, when he does it, you get lower germination rates. So collecting them fresh and early, you just don't need to mess with the fungus. It's a lot more straightforward. And so he'll plate the little seeds on the petri dish. They'll look like that on the left after they germinate, just these little blobs, basically. And after a while, they will all start producing only roots, no leaves or anything. They'll just look like a plate of spaghetti or parasitic worms or something like that. But they'll just basically be sitting in the dark producing this, which is what they'd normally be doing underground. And eventually he will take all these little noodles out of here and wash them off and throw them all in a bag, throw them in a cooler, basically to stimulate a winter, sending them into dormancy, and then bring them out in a few months, put them on a different type of nutrient media, and that's when they will form their first true leaves under light. And so when he's starting them off, this plate that they're putting on, it's agar media that's got some different nutrients and hormones in it that is different for each orchid. But also you can see these little discs here. That's basically a chunk of russet potato, and it's basically just to provide carbohydrates that these little ungainly things need to grow. But eventually they get transitioned to the outside world ex vitro and will start looking like actual plants, and they get grown out, and we distribute them to other botanic gardens just to get all these genetics from different sites backed up. And in some cases, we will plant them in the wild. We are going to plant a lot of the ones from East Texas back in the National Forest land We were supposed to have a student involved on it, but that kind of fell apart. So we're trying to devise our plan now as to how we're going to do it, and we're going to plant some around dogwoods and some not around dogwoods, and keep that on that. See if we can get any information. Talked about that. So I mentioned I was traveling back and forth, pollinating all these things, checking on them. That year I kept track of my mileage and basically put in 2,649 miles doing that, which is about equivalent to the width of the United States, I figured out. So just going back and forth in East Texas. And while doing that, I got to see these guys as well, which I think are the most alien looking orchid in our region. We had pollinated these, but these have always been a challenge to propagate in the lab. So we did get fruit on them, which you can see there, but Peter's still working out the protocols on this one to be able to get it going. So I figured I'd talk about some orchids around here in Williamson County, because I haven't, I've been talking about all the other areas of the state. Some of you may have even seen the chatterbox orchid before around some of the springs and seepages, especially around the limestone a little bit west of here. It's anywhere you'll see maidenhair fern, you can oftentimes find this orchid species. It's usually flowering around April or so, sometimes a little bit later if it's a dry year. But basically that's what the flowers look like. And it's called a chatterbox orchid because that lower lip, if you just barely touch it, it'll just start rocking back and forth. It's very lightly hinged and looks like it's talking to you. Yeah, very beautiful orchid. And even though we have it in the Central Texas, Edwards Plateau, and a few records even further east, you can see its range. It becomes very common out on the West Coast, especially in California, where it's a popular landscape plant. This is at Cattail Falls out in Big Bend National Park against the Chisos, where it's just a solid mass of them. These are in seed right here. But in California, it's a common garden plant. And there's even selections where there's purpley forms of it that naturally occur there that people have selected some of the best forms and grow it. This particular one, a friend of mine, Roger, selected that grows on the serpentine soils there. And, nobody's really sure if the serpentine has anything to do with the color or what, or if it's just coincidental, but it seems to hold the colors in, when not grown on serpentine. We named it Serpentine Night. Really beautiful one. It'd be nice to find a selection like that in our own local populations. Another one that you have around here, we talked about several ladies' tresses, but this one here is one of the most prevalent ones, and this one flowers around October here. And you tend to find this on like roadside embankments, especially where there's some limestone in the soil, but not always. It'll grow in kind of Blackland Prairie remnants as well. And very diverse in the shapes it can take on. A lot of these ladies' tresses, the flowers are arranged in a spiral, but sometimes you find them where they're not. They're just kind of in these linear arrangements going up and down the inflorescence there. And you can see it's got a very wide range. It's called the prairie ladies' tresses because you can see it's mostly in the prairie states there, but also occurs further east than some of these other calcareous habitats. And also occurs in my neck of the woods in Navasota area where we have some of that calcareous sandstone. That's where actually this photo was taken. The previous photo was actually taken up in Blanco County. Spiranthes sternua blooms at about the same time. Oh, I didn't mention about that previous one. The most fragrant of the ladies' tresses species. You smell it usually before you actually see it. Smells kind of like vanilla. Spiranthes sternua, this one is very widespread and also blooms around October at the same time, but it's much less picky in the soil it wants to grow. It could often just be a weed in landscapes and anywhere basically. Roadsides, people's lawns, it'll just come up and mowed lawns, and if it doesn't get mowed, it'll flower away. They can see it kind of cuts off right in central Texas there, but still it's pretty prevalent. And so sometimes you will actually, you'll find mixed in these what are called peloric forms or cleistogamous forms. And they basically always look like that. They look like they're in bud. They'll never, that's a normal one over on the other side that has normal open flowers. It'll produce these kind of bud-like protoflowers, but then the ovaries at the base of it, you can see they're swelling, especially at the lower portion there. They just basically bypass the flowering stage. They go from, they'll shoot up an inflorescence, act like they're going to flower, and then they're just basically producing self-pollinated fertile seeds within those ovaries. So that's what cleistogamous means. It's basically just a self-pollinating variation that occurs actually pretty commonly in Texas. Sometimes you'll see one population where it's all that form. Sometimes you'll see them mixed with the normal form. So just kind of a strange thing. What you can also see around here is we're getting into the mycoheterotrophic ones, kind of like that non-orchid plant I mentioned earlier. These are those ones that are basically tapped into the mycorrhizal, the fungus of that are associated with specifically oak trees. And these are pretty common, anywhere from sometimes as early as January, definitely February and March, and occasionally persisting into April. And what's strange is in East Texas, you'll only find these in really nice intact habitats. Get out this way, and they'll just be coming up in like islands and parking lots, and anywhere there's just an oak. They just don't seem to care out here. I've seen them in just the most inhospitable places. Just as long as there's an oak tree and that has that necessary fungus, they'll just pop up, and they're totally happy. So definitely keep your eyes out for these if you haven't seen them. Occasionally you can find weird, like bright yellow forms of it too. And again, none of these have chlorophyll. They're entirely dependent on the nutrients it gets from the trees through the fungus. Same thing on these guys, Hexalectris, which some people want to move in the genus Bledia, but that's still kind of debated. If you do iNaturalist, they changed it to Bledia, but they're notorious for changing things prematurely before things are settled out enough. So I still call it Hexalectris, but you'll definitely see that Bledia name a lot. This particular one is one of the more common ones from here down through San Antonio and kind of the eastern escarpment of the Edwards Plateau. And these also will just come up in just some of those same disturbed places like the coral rise that we looked at earlier. And this is another one that kind of like that lady stresses that I mentioned. It's cleistogamous, where the flowers usually do not open. It'll just that's about the most it'll do. It'll just look like a bud that's about to open, but then that ovary just behind it will start swelling and forming a seed pod. And so basically it's self-pollinated. But you can occasionally find some that do have open flowers. And they don't quite open fully like some of the other related species. And nobody's really looked at if they truly get pollinated or not. But you do see these variations sometimes where they're in different stages of openness. And those are normally flowering in the summertime, including about now, July, early August. Hexalectris spicata is a very wide-ranging one that also occurs in this area here. Again, all these mycoheterotrophs are always associating with oaks and their mycorrhizae. This one was taken in East Texas, but generally the ones out here are a little bit more subdued in their color. They don't have as much of the orangey tones in them. They're more of like a tan color, but still have the purple striping on them. Usually you don't see a cluster that impressive. Usually it's just 3 or 4 stems, flowering stems, but this is one that always consistently produces a nice mass of them out in Davy, Crockett National Forest. And then out in West Texas, and then occasionally up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, you can find this one here. There are some historic records from west of here, so it's always possible that these could crop up again somewhere in the region. And I'm sure someone will definitely notice if they do find it, because you just can't miss this hot pink plant. Very large flowers, and the flowers are like that wide, and just looks like some tropical thing that you wouldn't expect to see growing in these rather dry areas. And this one too. This one is there's a city park up in Dallas that has a really nice population of these blooming right around the 4th of July. But they're kind of scattered around the Edwards Plateau, going up in the Trans-Pecos region as well. Hexalectris, the name refers to the little crest. The common name for these collectively is crested coral root. So you see a little crest on the lip there. Hexa means 6. A couple of the species will have 6 ridges, but most of them, as you can see here, don't. Around 3 to 5. And occasionally, again, you can, with all these species, you can find these weird yellow to white forms cropping up that are just basically kind of like an albino form. And a non-native one, we do have this one species here from China that just very suddenly has started showing up in Texas. Just within the past 6 or 8 years. It has been established in Florida for quite a while, and started popping up in Houston, and then it's really only been the past like 3 or 4 years where it's just like suddenly it was in San Antonio, and now I see records here as well. I don't think this is going to be anything that's going to invade natural areas, because it really only seems to like disturbed areas, and specifically it seems like mulch beds of all things. It seems like whatever's going on with the fungi or whatever microbial communities are going on there, it just provides all the right conditions for the seed germination of this. A lot of people think that it gets moved around with mulch, but I think it's more that the mulch provides the right conditions for these windblown seeds to land on, especially out here, where in this drier area where you need that moisture to be able to get going. But it's a very attractive orchid. Usually when you see it, it immediately grabs your attention, and people get excited. But it's easy to cultivate too. I mean, if you find them, you can always pluck them out of the ground and just enjoy the blooms. And if you don't want it escaping and invading any further, just dispose of any of the capsules that form. It has very large, what are called pseudobulbs that stick up from the soil. They can get like that big around, basically, look like little green onions that the flowering stems are raised up from. So keep an eye out for that one. And we'll wrap it up with just this one cool experience here in Texas that consumed several years of my life here in Davy Crockett National Forest. So there's this, what's called the three birds orchid. And this is a very unusual orchid in that some people have like spent their entire life trying to catch it in flower. And so I decided to do that too. There's only one known little tiny population that was discovered in 2002 in Davy Crockett National Forest, just north of Lupkin. And Peter Luce, the guy I mentioned earlier, he was involved with that discovery and showed me where they were. And we went back there and we found them. And this is how you usually find them. You find they're just these little tiny things. You usually find either these buds or fruit capsules, just seed capsules, just hanging there. You can see the pine cones just for scale. But you can check them every day, and they'll just basically be in suspended animation. And this species is wide ranging all throughout eastern North America. These Texas ones are the westernmost population here. There are some other historic records in East Texas, but again, this is the only remaining one anybody knows about. And a lot of people have their stories for their recipes of when exactly to catch them to bloom after a certain cooling period and then a certain amount of rain. They'll suddenly flower for a single day, and then and come a day late and they're already wilted. A good friend of mine, and he actually, if you ever saw the, his name was Jim Fowler, if you ever saw the orchid stamps that got issued by the government a number of years ago, they were all based off of his photos. Was a photographer in out of South Carolina until he passed away a couple of years ago. But he basically thought he had it figured out, where basically temperature drop associated with rain during the summertime. So a significant drop from what have been the normal warm conditions. And 3 days after that is when you'll catch them in flower. And so it's like, okay, this population was 3 hours north of me. And so I would always watch for that first somewhat of a nighttime temperature drop during July, whatever that means here in Texas. But usually when we would get like a tropical storm coming in that would dissipate and that low pressure would come in, it would actually draw in some cool air from the north. And so that particular year we had that scenario occur. There were actually some very refreshing temperatures at night where it actually got down into the 70s. Imagine that this time of the year, this year. And so I went up there 3 days after that first temperature drop, and I saw wilted flowers. I had just missed them. But then I started talking to him. I was like, what he had told me was you have that first temperature drop and then 1, 2, 3 days later. But I had to clarify with him, is that day with the temperature drop included in that first day or 3 days after that? And then he had to think about that. And eventually he was like, no, I think you're right. I think it's including that first day. And so later that year, I think it was like late September, we had an actual cold front where it dropped the temperature like a few degrees. And I thought, okay, because they will do a few waves per 1 year, these single day flowering events. And so I included that cool down day as one of the days. And 2 days after that, I went up there and they were cracked open, but not all the way open. But I was there in the morning. I was thinking maybe I need to wait a little bit. And then I started looking around and I saw this bee on it. And see all that purple stuff on it? That's basically the pollinium from this orchid. And so I was like, I must have missed it. They must have bloomed the other day. He has all that pollinia that he collected the previous day. And these flowers are actually closing rather than opening. And so I was kind of frustrated. I looked around among hundreds of plants. I found this one that was open enough for me. And I was like, okay, that's good enough. So I spent forever with my cell phone trying to get a clear enough photo of all the detail, the little green tubercles in there. You can see the purple dots up there. That's that purple pollen that was on the bee there. I considered that a success. One plant out of hundreds that was reasonably open. But then the next cold snap the next year, I hit it just right, and they were open. And not just a few, but the whole thing. And it was well worth all the several years of trouble prior to that to finally succeed in catching this. That being everything in the frame, there is the only Texas population of this plant within the state here. And there's one in Louisiana before they become a little bit more common further east. But yeah, it was pretty amazing. They call them three birds orchid is the common name, even though because occasionally they will have 3 flowers on one stalk, and I guess someone's imagination thought it looked like 3 little birds flying around, but usually you only see 1 to 2, so the name's kind of misleading. I don't really like common names anyway. And sorry about using mostly Latin names through here. Have you ever wondered why dinosaurs don't have common names? Did you ever think about that? 3-year-olds can learn Latin names of dinosaurs, but then everybody complains about common names everywhere else. Think about that. We can learn Latin names too if you're someone that's resistant. It's not that scary. But yeah, whenever I tell people that, they're like, "Those are Latin names?" So it was just kind of a lot of the people that have been involved with this, and I've definitely forgotten a lot of these folks. And you can see Joe Liggio up there, and his co-author for that book there, and she passed away about a year ago, unfortunately. Yeah, a lot of folks you'll probably recognize, like Jason Singerst and TxDOT and so many other just private individuals that helped out with this. So yes, even though I don't live here, I've still got a lot of projects going on, both with orchids and with other things. For the longest time, I tried to hate orchids because everybody likes them, but orchids just have a way of drawing you in and making you want to protect them. So fortunately, my business is supportive of paying me to come continue doing this and working with all the local collaborators here and people at other gardens to preserve all this work very little people know about that's going on kind of behind the scenes. So thank you very much.